activities are, on average, so harmful that we need to have a rule against them. Even if that means that sometimes we can't do them when it would be advantageous to do them. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So even if doing X will actually do some good, you shouldn't do X, because if you do X, you'll break the rule, and the rule as a whole is a good rule. And war is such a thing. Okay. Most of the time, it does an awful lot more harm than good. And therefore, we shouldn't be doing it, even when we might think it might do something. So to make this argument, I'm going to go through several steps. This is what I'm going to talk about today. So first, I will discuss the nature and causes of the conflicts in which we are intervening, and show that these are complex phenomena which we do not properly understand and cannot control. These conflicts matter far more to the people being intervened against than they do to us. As a result, these people will resist us and will outstay us. Second, I will discuss the nature of the primary tool we use to try and solve these conflicts, namely armed force. I will show that armed force is, by its nature, ill-suited to solving complex political problems, and should be limited to occasions when its use is absolutely necessary to protect genuinely vital interests. Third, I will look to see if genuinely vital interests are at stake in the conflicts in which we intervene. And the answer, I will say, is no. And fourth, I will look at our efforts to combine armed force with other tools such as economic assistance, and show that these other tools don't actually work any better. Attempting to defeat insurgencies by throwing billions of dollars in aid at them doesn't succeed. We lack the knowledge to carry out the so-called whole-of-government approach to intervention effectively. And fifth and finally, I will look at the costs of intervention. These are high, as too are the opportunity costs, the things we don't do because we are spending our time and resources on war. If we want to make the world a better place, there are much better ways of doing it than military intervention. And I will provide a few examples. So let's start by looking at the nature of the conflicts in which we intervene. Now, two types of justification are normally provided for military intervention overseas, selfish ones and selfless ones. The selfish justifications are ones which say that military intervention is necessary to eliminate some threat to our security, so we intervene because it will make us safer. The invasion of Iraq is a case in point. The Americans and the British maintained that if left in power, Saddam Hussein might give his alleged weapons of mass destruction to terrorists, who would then use them against the United States and Britain and kill large numbers of people. Therefore, war was necessary in order to protect those people. Similarly, the military campaign in Afghanistan and the campaigns now underway in Iraq and Syria are justified by the claim that if we don't defeat terrorism over there, the terrorists will come over here and kill us. The selfless justifications are ones which say that we must intervene in order to protect human rights. So NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia was a case in point. NATO claimed that Yugoslavia was committing genocide in Kosovo and that the bombing was necessary to protect the Kosovo people. Similarly, NATO claimed that its intervention in Libya was required in order to protect Libyans from assault by Gaddafi's forces. In very rare cases, such as the invasion of Iraq, Western states start a war where there wasn't a war going on in the first place. But most of the time, we are intervening in conflicts which already exist. Be it the Yugoslav civil wars, the Libyan civil war, or the insurgencies in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. So the first thing we need to do before determining whether intervention is wise is to determine the nature of these civil conflicts. And the first thing to note about them is that they are not solely or even primarily military conflicts. I think this is important to understand. Take Iraq, for instance. ISIS didn't suddenly take over half of Iraq because it was militarily stronger than the Iraqi army. Okay. Far from it. The Iraqi army had been given billions of dollars of equipment and years of training by the Americans. They were much stronger militarily than ISIS, but they collapsed almost overnight. Why? Because the army soldiers weren't interested in fighting. And that begs the question, of course, why weren't they interested in fighting? And why were many of the locals in the areas which ISIS overran willing to support ISIS? A large portion of the Sunni population decided that they prefer to be ruled by ISIS than by the Iraqi government. Among the ISIS leaders in Iraq are many former members of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, okay, who are not Islamic ideologues, far from. Okay. So many local tribal leaders have joined them. These aren't interested in the ISIS jihadist ideology, but they despise their government. Okay. And so they decided to join forces. In short, the military conflict in Iraq is more than just a military conflict. Okay. It is a symptom of a deeper problem of government legitimacy. It's basically a political problem. And this is true in elsewhere as well. It's true in Afghanistan, it's true in Syria. It's true in all of these civil conflicts. At the same time, many of these conflicts have a bewildering number of participants. Okay. You can't simply divide the war in Syria, for instance, into good guys and bad guys who are fighting each other. There's the government, there's ISIS, there's the Kurds, there's the Nusra Front, there's the Free Syrian Army, and then a bunch of others. Okay. None of them are really the good guys. And some of them are fighting the government, some of them are fighting ISIS, some of them are fighting both the government and ISIS. Sometimes they're our friends, sometimes they're not. It's incredibly complicated. Okay? There isn't two sides here, there's multiple sides, which are interlocking in very strange ways. Intervening in such a war involves intervening on behalf of one of these guys against the other lot. So really it means involving intervening on behalf of one bunch of bad guys against another bunch of bad guys, if you want to simplify this. And so it requires serious moral compromise. Okay? This isn't something which is a black and white moral activity. Okay? You must understand that if you're going to get in the game of military intervention, you are deep in the realm of moral compromise. It also means getting mixed up in something which is extremely complex. And the problem is that, not being locals, we actually don't understand the complexities. We don't really know what's going on. We don't know the reasons why the local actors act the way they do. So in Afghanistan, for instance, we overthrew the Taliban and then supported the new government in fighting the Taliban without ever asking, why was it that many of the locals supported the Taliban in the first place? When Canadian forces arrived in Kandahar province, the result was, once we drove out the Taliban, was that the same guys who previously ran Kandahar province came back. But there was a reason why the Taliban took over Kandahar provinces in the first place, which was the locals really didn't like these guys. And yet we brought them back, and then we were surprised when the locals started shooting at us. Which really we ought not to be, but it shows that we really just don't get the local dynamics. We don't know enough about them. We don't understand the culture, we don't know the history, we don't know the politics, we don't know the society. Basically, we don't know the local dynamics, and we're not able, therefore, to predict the ways in which people will react to our intervention. Okay? So when you intervene in such a complex environment, you are setting off something which you really cannot predict. The future, well, you can't predict how people are going to react and what's going to happen. And it's always unwise to embark on an activity when you don't actually know what the results of the activity are going to be. One thing, though, we can be sure of is that the war is going to matter a lot more to the locals than it is to us. We might say that we're intervening in Iraq and Syria or Afghanistan because we have important interests at stake, but they're not actually really that important. If they were really that important, we'd be doing a hell of a lot more than we're doing. We as Canada would not just be sending 6 planes and then deciding actually we're not going to send 6 planes after all, we can take them back. Okay? We would be doing an awful lot more than that if this was something which we really felt was a vital interest to us. We could tell by the really lack of effort we make. But it's not actually that significant. But of course, it is significant to the people there. Their will to fight will therefore always be bigger than ours. In most cases, those intervened against will fight, if only because people don't like being intervened against. And they will outlast us. In short, the conflicts in which we intervene are not primarily military in nature. They're extremely complex, and settling them requires a deep understanding of local environment which we simply do not possess. Moreover, they are conflicts which do not touch our vital interests, and I'll come on to that again in a little moment, and which therefore we will never, donate sufficient resources to actually solve. It's not only the nature of the conflict which makes intervention unwise, it's the nature of the tool we use in order to intervene, in other words, military force, or to give it its proper name, war. So, let's take a look at war. But there are some activities, I say, just before I get onto my real consequentialist philosophy here, there are some activities which so regularly produce negative results, but even the most rigid consequentialist should surely agree that there's a solid case for banning them. Even if that means foregoing the occasional, or the exceptional occasion when that activity might be useful. The fact that on rare occasions the benefits for one of the parties outweighs that party's cost shouldn't hide the fact that overall war is an activity the world would be better off without. So when thinking of the rules which should guide us and the rules which should guide the international order, okay, we should always be seeking to restrict it, not to make it easier. Alas, we allow our occasional successes to cloud our judgment, enable us to forget all our failures. So a few years ago, many were celebrating NATO's apparent military triumph in effecting regime change in Libya. No one really celebrates it much anymore, but a few years ago everyone was saying, yeah, didn't we do well? Okay? And then they started using that as a case, as an argument for further military interventions, okay? Forgetting entirely the dismal result of such interventions in the past. Okay? So like British Prime Minister David Cameron, for instance, said, look how successful we were in Libya, now we should invade us, now we should be intervening in Syria. That was the first time we tried to do it. So we're a bit like gamblers who have just won a session at the roulette table and who've come away convinced that finally we've worked out how to win at roulette. But the fact that you can sometimes win at roulette is not a good argument for playing roulette. Okay? Because if you keep playing roulette, you will lose. Guaranteed. Therefore, you shouldn't play roulette. Now, true, that means you will forego all the many times when you actually would have won. Okay? But you will be better off as a result. Okay? And it is the same with war. In war, as in roulette, you will lose most of the time. This is actually mathematical certainty. Okay? Both sides cannot win. Okay? Anyone can agree with that? Both sides can't win, right? So, maximum number of winners in war is 50%. But in reality, most of the time, nobody wins. Right? So in reality, the number of winners in war is well below 50%. And even when you win, it's often not worth winning. Okay? So actually, the odds that you're going to come up better off in war are extremely slim. Okay? And this is actually, mathematically obvious. Okay? And we can see this in the wars fought by Western states in the past 25 years. The first Gulf War seemed to end successfully. That was the one in 1991. But it left so much unresolved that it led in due course to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which, as we all know, was a disaster and has led to the current chaos in Iraq. So even the first Gulf War doesn't actually look so good in retrospect. Kosovo was also less successful than the supporters made it out to be. Rather than preventing a humanitarian disaster, it actually provoked one. It also created a precedent which is being used by other countries to justify their own actions. It dealt a terrible blow to basic principles of international law. The next major Western war, the invasion of Iraq, as I said, was an untrammeled disaster. While the war in Afghanistan, even if you're being generous to it, you could say is inconclusive. The combined might of NATO has been unable to defeat the peasant soldiers of the Taliban. NATO, which spends 75% of the world's defense spending. NATO's other campaign, the bombing of Libya, has produced civil war in neighboring Mali and now civil war in Libya itself. It is simply put a mess. So the record of our military interventions is, to put it mildly, far from brilliant. It is therefore strange that we think that our current war will end any differently. Moreover, just as most wars fail, most wars are unjust. Again, this is mathematically certain. Okay, so we're going to go into a bit of moral philosophy for a moment. Okay, both sides can't be just. Matter front row knows them, then we don't buy just war course. Okay, I mean, if both sides were just, they wouldn't be fighting each other. So at most, half of the people fighting a war have justice on their side. But again, actually, most of the time, neither side has complete justice on its side. So it is a mathematical certainty that most people fighting wars are not fighting a just war. Okay. Particularly as the criteria of just war theory are extremely difficult to satisfy. So therefore, you face the fact that the more wars you fight, the more certain it is that you will suffer loss because you'll lose, and the more certain it is that you'll be fighting an immorally unjustifiable war. So if nothing else, it is in our interest to set up rules which bind our hands and make it as hard as possible for us to engage in this self-destructive activity. Most wars are unsuccessful, most wars are unjust. Therefore, from a rule consequentialist position, you should prohibit war. Okay. My argument here, therefore, is that it is a certainty that less war is better than more war. So, the rules which produce the best consequences are those which restrict war the most, ideally those which prohibit it entirely. Therefore, even if one specific war does seem to satisfy the criteria of just war theory, or does seem to be likely to produce positive consequences, it is still not right to start it, because doing so violates the rule which produces the greatest benefits overall. Now, I make no apologies for making this argument. We're discussing here not whether it is just or a good idea to bomb Syria, a specific case, but whether generally we should be engaging in military intervention, and what we generally should be engaging in military intervention is no, okay? Because it is a certainty that it will, on average, be unsuccessful and unjust. So why is it that war tends not to produce the positive results its supporters hope it will? So the great Prussian military philosopher Karl von Clausewitz provided an answer. Anyone who did my ECH course remember this. Clausewitz rejected scientific formulations. Okay, so he was sort of reacting to the rationalism of the Enlightenment. He said these scientific formulations make a mistake of assuming that war is a one-sided process. So if you do X, Y will happen. But war is a two-sided process, he pointed out. It's an interaction, he said, not the action of a living force upon a lifeless mass, but always the collision of two living forces. So models which ignore this fact will be incorrect, said Clausewitz, because, I'll quote him here, they aim at fixed values, but in war everything is uncertain, and calculations have to be made with variable quantities. They, that's the rationalist models, direct the inquiry exclusively towards physical quantities, whereas all military action is intertwined with psychological forces and effects. They consider only unilateral action, whereas war consists of a continuous interaction of opposites. What this means is that scientific rationalism has no place in war. War is the realm of chaos, chance, and uncertainty. As Clausewitz pointed out, no other human activity is so continuously or universally bound up with chance. The one thing you can predict about war is that it will be unpredictable. It's a very blunt instrument, inherently ill-suited to the achievement of specific policy goals. Yet we continue to ignore this fact and act as if we can use force as a precise instrument to solve this or that problem in a predictable fashion with predictable outcomes. This is extremely foolish and represents a sort of liberal fantasy, or using liberal in the way Matt wouldn't like this. I'll do that anyway. A liberal fantasy which ignores the nature of the environment in which our actions are taking place. Okay? An environment which is characterized, as Clausewitz said, by uncertainty and chaos. Again and again, we are surprised that our wars have taken longer than we expected, have met more resistance than we expected, have not turned out the way we expected. And we excuse ourselves by saying, nobody could have predicted that this or that would have happened. But even if it is true that we cannot have predicted that this or that specific thing could have happened, we could have predicted that something would have happened. Something always does go wrong. You should never be surprised in war that you have been surprised. So let us return to my comparison with roulette. War, Clausewitz pointed out, is a form of gambling. And he wrote this, he said, in the whole range of human activities, war most closely resembles a game of cards. Actually, it's worse than that, but the stakes are higher and the odds far more stacked against you than in any game of cards. You should be aware, therefore, that if you support military intervention, you are gambling. And you're gambling with very high stakes and very bad odds. War is the realm of uncertainty of chance, of chaos and incoherence, of confusion and blindness. As such, it should be avoided except in cases of absolute necessity. So, are the wars in which we've been intervening wars of absolute necessity? And by absolute necessity, I really mean, if you don't fight them, you're going to be killed, you're going to be destroyed. Now, in case of the supposedly selfless wars I mentioned, the wars of humanitarian intervention and so on, the answer is necessarily no. Right? If you're doing it for some other person, you don't need to do it in order to survive. It may be a good thing to do, okay, but you can't say that it is necessary for your survival. Okay? It doesn't constitute a vital national interest. Okay? So that leaves for selfish wars. Okay? Those are the only ones we can really talk about as being vital national interests. The wars which are fought to supposedly destroy some terrible threat. So how dangerous are the threats in reality? Well, the answer, I think, is not as dangerous as they're made out to be. If they really were that dangerous, we'd be putting in a lot more effort than we really are. And the fact that we don't actually put in much effort, I think, is a subtle recognition that they're not as threatening to us as we think they are. So in the case of the invasion of Iraq, of course, sort of an extreme example, we were provided all sorts of horror stories about weapons of mass destruction, potential mushroom clouds, and all the rest of it. And as we know, none of those have any basis in reality. Nowadays, the threat that people conjure up to justify military intervention is terrorism. Okay, so the wars in Iraq and Syria and the intervention by Western powers there is justified by the threat of terrorism. And we're told that only by destroying terrorists over there can we stop them coming here. But actually, the terrorist threat is not all it's cracked up to be. So the Paris attacks, particularly, have made people in Europe start saying about how Western civilization is under threat, and ISIS is a horrible, horrible threat which we really must go to war to destroy. But let's actually look at how much terrorism there is in Europe. Is this actually true? So what you see here is a chart showing the number of terrorist events and the number of deaths from terrorism in Western Europe from 1970 through the current day. And as you can see, these are grey, shaded in grey areas, the number of events, and the blue lines, the number of people killed. As you can see, there's actually an awful lot more terrorism and an awful lot more people being killed in the 1970s and 1980s than there are today. In fact, there's probably about half as many events and half as many deaths. And even today, occasionally you get the biggies like Paris, but most years you really only get, maybe a dozen people in the whole Western Europe being killed. It's the idea that we're facing or Europeans are facing some cataclysmic terrorist threat, which is much, much greater than anything they faced in the past, and which therefore requires a much more aggressive military policy, simply isn't borne out by the facts. Okay. And what about North America? I've got a little chart here with number of terrorist total number of terrorist attacks in red and fatal terrorist attacks black dotted line in the United States from 1970 to 2011. As you can see, there's an awful lot less terrorism than there used to be in North America. The odds of being killed by a terrorist in North America are stunningly low. You're actually more likely to die by being killed by hot tap water. I'm not quite sure how that works, but according to statistics from the United States, that's true. Okay. So, you know, we're not really facing a cataclysmic threat which requires us to engage in military intervention overseas. So this isn't necessary. So we go back in my logic a bit. I was saying that you should only engage in war if it is absolutely necessary. Okay? It isn't absolutely necessary. Therefore, we shouldn't do it. Now, none of this is to say that terrorism is not a problem. Okay, that there's no chance of you being killed by terrorists. Okay, that there's no threat out there. Obviously, that would not be correct. Okay, but it's not a threat to our very existence as a society. Okay, we can live with it and we can cope with it using traditional policing and intelligence techniques. It isn't so deadly that military intervention is necessary. So let's talk about the tools which we use. Because not only is military intervention not necessary, we don't actually have appropriate tools at our disposal. Particularly, we don't have tools to deal with the kind of very complex phenomena I talked about. As I said, these conflicts really are very, very complex. And they involve local, political, social, and economic factors of which we are often ignorant. And our military just aren't equipped to deal with those kind of things. Okay, what military forces are good at is destroying things and killing people. Okay, they're trained and equipped to use violence. Okay, that is what our armed forces are set up to do. Okay, we have tanks, we have heavy artillery, we have armored personnel carriers, we have fighter aircraft, we have submarines. Okay, we have frigates and all that stuff. Okay. These are great for fighting other tanks and artillery pieces and fighter aircraft and submarines and frigates. They're not so great for eliminating the insurgent in the Iraqi desert or in a town somewhere, nor are they particularly good at providing humanitarian assistance to people. But because they're the tools that we have, they're the tools that we use. And it's hardly surprising that the results aren't good. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan led to a renewed interest in counterinsurgency theory, and some effort therefore has in fact been made to restructure our armed forces and to retrain them and re-equip them to fight not conventional wars against other military armed forces, but to fight counterinsurgency. But the effort has been half-hearted. We put a little bit of effort into restructuring our armed forces for counterinsurgency and so on. But actually most of the money still goes into tanks and planes and submarines and aircraft carriers and frigates. Which are, again, you know, not really very useful. Okay, they're oriented towards fighting other traditionally armed armies and navies and air forces. So really, the military forces we have just aren't equipped to fight the kind of complex wars which we might have to fight. Moreover, the evidence suggests that even the attempts to restructure them in order to do so haven't been very successful. So in Afghanistan, for instance, we imagined that we could use our troops as a combination of war fighters and economic development providers. The problem with this is that soldiers just aren't very good as economic development providers. Okay? They're not. It's not something, you know, they have any particular expertise in. You know, you've been trained to, you know, drive a tank. Why would you actually know how to improve the economy of Afghanistan? You know, or to provide, you know, a better society in the local Afghan village. Like, you wouldn't, okay? It's not something on which you have any knowledge at all. Okay. Furthermore, the military tend to be really interested in short-term military benefits. What they want to do is make the locals a little bit happy so they stop shooting at them. Okay. So they will use what resources they have to short-term aid projects which they think will sort of win some short-term hearts and minds, and not really think about the long-term consequences. Okay. And the results, therefore, tend to be misspent resources. Okay. Resources spent on often useless and sometimes counterproductive projects. So the United States government employs an auditor called John Sopko. That's this guy here. This is Mr. Sopko. He's called the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR. It's really worth reading his reports. They're quite stunning, actually. His job is to check on the $110 billion which the United States has spent on reconstruction in Afghanistan. In a recent speech, Sopko criticized what he called, what's called the Commander's Emergency Response Program. So the Commander's Emergency Response Program, CERP, is a program whereby the US Army gives money to commanders to spend on providing economic and social assistance to Afghans. Sopko said this: incredibly, for the first 9 years of CERP's existence, I have not been able to find a single clearly articulated mention of the program's true objectives in any official document. It should surprise no one that sustainability of CERP-funded schools has been singled out because, say, they are literally crumbling and falling apart, or that CERP-funded hospitals actually became unsafe because their electrical and water supply systems failed. What about the anecdotal evidence about CERP's successes, Sopko asked. How supposedly CERP has saved the lives of our troops, built trust where it was lacking, and furthered the security mission in Afghanistan? I can't actually verify that. No one can. When I can't even tell what the program's basic objectives were, I certainly can't tell you whether it's succeeding or not. As far as the other aid to Afghanistan is concerned, apart from CERP, Sopko gives an example of typical spending results. $15 million spent by US aid on a new hospital in Gardez, which was 12 times larger than the previous hospital. There was just one problem, says Sopko. US aid did not fully assess the Afghan Ministry of Public Health's ability to operate and maintain the hospital once completed. In the end, US aid managed to increase the cost for the Afghans to operate a hospital in Gardez by a factor of 5. I wish I could say that this is an isolated incident, but this sort of thing happens in Afghanistan all the time. You would think that after 13 years of these types of occurrences, that someone would wake up, look around and say, you know what, folks, maybe we're going about this all wrong. And it seems that time and time again, people have to be reminded that Afghanistan is not Kansas. So government officials like to say that we have learned that modern interventions require more than just military power, and that we have learned the need for a so-called whole-of-government approach. But Sopko's statements show that the truth is we're really bad at it. This whole-of-government, we stink at it, frankly. For some reason, we imagine that we can go into another country and teach the local people how to run their own affairs better than they do themselves, even when we don't actually know what's going on in that place, and we only have the slightest knowledge of the local complexity. Again and again, we fail. And as Sopko points out, we just repeat the same old errors. Okay, the reality is, while we know how to smash stuff up, very well indeed, okay, we don't know how to put it all back together again. Okay, and if anyone tells you that they do, sorry for those of you studying in development and globalization, BA or MA. But sorry, the fact is that we don't. Okay, and we should stop kidding ourselves if we do. What is if we do know how to do it, we're really bad at actually doing it? Okay? Maybe there's someone out there who actually does know how to do it, but it's not what we do. Okay. Now, none of this would matter if all this intervention was cost-free. So the fact it went wrong, okay, so what? It doesn't cost us anything, no biggie, right? But of course, it isn't cost-free. And the costs in terms of lives and treasure are extremely large. tens of thousands of dead, and trillions, I mean, quite literally trillions of dollars of expenditure. These military interventions are not cheap. Nearly 5,000 American Allied soldiers lost their lives in the war in Iraq, which is estimated to have cost the United States somewhere between $1 and $3 trillion. The number of Iraqi dead is unknown, but possibly around 200,000. Around 3,000 to 4,000 coalition troops have lost their lives in Afghanistan. Afghan deaths are certainly much higher. The financial cost of the war in Afghanistan is about another $1 trillion. Suffice it to say, war nearly always kills more people than it saves, and any financial benefits derived from it are almost always outweighed by the financial cost. But the costs of war go beyond the immediate loss of life and treasure. War also has a negative impact on our society and on our forms of government. There's a reason why this talk is sponsored by the Institute of Liberal Studies, which is that military intervention is not good for liberty. There's an effect not just on societies we intervening, but there is an impact indirectly on our own society. War and military spending tend to subvert constitutional arrangements, augment executive power beyond its proper bounds, and establish a system of vested interests which distorts priorities, raises taxes, and sucks the state into repeated unnecessary conflicts. So you may imagine that if you fight a war and win or lose, that's the end of it. Okay, war's over. We just go back to things the way they were beforehand. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Okay? To fight the war, you have to create armed forces. Okay? And the prospect of perhaps having to fight another similar war means that you then keep these armed forces in being once the war is over. So previous wars are what justify peacetime defense spending. So every time you fight a war, you are laying the foundation for continued military spending thereafter. So the costs of the Afghanistan war aren't just the costs of the Afghanistan war, they're the costs of higher defense spending thereafter. The problem is that the very existence of the military forces you've then created encourages you to go fight other wars. Okay? You fight wars because, particularly in a non-environment where we have pretty much unconstrained military power, we fight wars because we can. So the costs of a given war are not restricted to the war in question, but continue to grow throughout the years that follow. High levels of peacetime military expenditures, which are a product of a tendency to wage war, damage our democratic government. They create what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, which doesn't really exist. There's not like an organization called the military-industrial complex which has membership cards, and they sit in a smoke-filled room somewhere conspiring how to undermine democratic government. Okay, it's not quite like that. It's much more amorphous. It's a sort of association of politicians, defense industries, lobbyists, defense-funded scientists, security studies professors, okay, and others, who, whether deliberately or not, combine to keep defense spending high, even when it's not required, by exaggerating threats and overstating the ability of military power to deal with the problems which our societies face. This keeps us in a state of permanent fear, which serves as an excuse not only to raise taxes to support the said military-industrial complex, but also to facilitate the expansion of executive power in the name of security. Okay? So, through military intervention, we end up with an expansion of executive power. With this, the checks and balances essential to the functioning democratic government are weakened. Civil liberties are necessarily sacrificed, while the legislature and the judiciary surrender their authority in the face of the executive's claims to be protecting us. These are the direct and indirect costs of war, but there's another type of cost which also matter. These are the opportunity costs. Okay? Those of you who've done Introduction to Economics 100, okay, should know that the opportunity costs are often forgotten, but they're extremely important. They are really things we don't do because we're doing something else. So resources are limited. Okay? We only have so much money, we only have so much time. So there's only so many things we can do. Okay? If we choose to do one thing, it means we're not doing another thing. Okay? So if we're to act responsibly, we must choose to do those things which are the most efficient. those things which use our limited resources best. It's not enough for the benefits of a given action to outweigh the costs for that action to be a wise one. So even if an action is profitable, it is still not necessarily the correct action, okay? Because another action could be more profitable. So even if you can argue that a given war did more good than harm, waging that war was not necessarily the correct thing to do because something else might have been done which produced even more good and even less harm. With war, this is in fact most often the case. The opportunity costs are extremely high. The money spent on war, even if it is a successful war, is money which could be spent on something else. And something else almost certainly far more productive. So take the current passion for humanitarian intervention. Popular support for the war in Afghanistan, for instance, was sustained in large part through the perception that NATO was helping to restore human rights, educate women, develop the Afghan economy, and so on. Okay, so military intervention is making the world a better place. Okay, and perhaps, you know, maybe NATO's campaign has produced some positive results in those areas. Okay, so more women are being educated, and maybe human rights are a bit better, and maybe the Afghan economy is a little bit better. Okay. But it's cost us $1 trillion to do it. Okay. If you think about the returns, any benefits we've got from a humanitarian perspective, compared with the amount of money we spent, you realize this is not a very cost-effective way of doing it. Okay? And again, at this point, I'll quote Mr. Sopko, the American Special Inspector General for Afghanistan. He says this: "Here we are, almost 14 years into our $1 trillion effort with over 2,000 American lives sacrificed. At the risk of sounding dramatic, we can't honestly point to some actual measurable accomplishments from that massive investment." That's the US auditor who's actually responsible for saying whether there was anything came out of these investments. Okay, the actual American auditor says we can't honestly point to some actual measurable accomplishments. That's really quite staggering, actually, when you think that they spent $1 trillion. It's a huge indictment. Now, imagine what else you could have done with $1 trillion. Okay? One study which examined the cost-benefit ratios of international policies concluded that if you want to improve the world, the most cost-effective policies which you can undertake include providing micronutrients to children, liberalizing trade, that's what I'm about, immunizing children, lowering the price of schooling, and increasing schooling for girls. Okay, so you consider how many billions of dollars we, Canada, have spent in Afghanistan, producing maybe some benefits, okay? Let's just be generous for a moment, say maybe there's been some benefits, okay? If we introduced real free trade here, like we got rid of, what do they call it, the farmers, the supply management, okay? So that farmers in the third world could export their produce into Canada, okay? That would cost our farmers a bit of money, and maybe we'd have to pay them something, and it would cost us a few $1 billion, but less than it's cost us in Afghanistan. But we would definitely make some third world farmers better off. So actually, which is the better thing to do? Why is it that we wage war in the name of helping other people, but we don't reduce trade barriers? Which would actually be more cost effective. So even if military intervention in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, or anywhere else does produce some good, it's most unlikely that it is the greatest good that the resources applied to it could produce. Spending that money on something else will almost certainly produce great benefits. And there's a lot of evidence to support this conclusion. According to a recent report published by the World Health Organization, malaria control measures saved an estimated 1.2 million lives in Africa between 2000 and 2011. Okay. So 1.2 million lives were saved from malaria in that decade. And a further 3 million lives could be saved by this year, this report's a couple of years old, if we continue the efforts. In countries where access to malaria-controlled interventions have improved most significantly, overall child mortality rates have fallen by approximately 20%. How much do you think it costs to save those 1.2 million lives? I don't want to hazard a number.
$5 million.
No, it's a lot. It's a bit more than that. It's actually 1.5 billion, okay? But to give you some perspective, that's how much the United States and NATO spend in Afghanistan weekly. Okay? So that's a cost of intervention in Afghanistan for a week. And it saved 1.2 million lives. And they've saved by, that's 2011, they've saved another 3 million lives. Okay. If you compare the results of that with the trillions of dollars we have spent on defense and on war in the past decade, it is clear which provides value for money and which does not. And not just by a little bit, by a massive, massive margin. We would do well to remember President Eisenhower's stark words in his final speech to the President, where he wrote, quote, or he said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone, it is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." The late American theologian Walter Wink wrote that the primary myth of modern popular culture is the myth of redemptive violence. And he discussed like kids' cartoons like Tom and Jerry and all the rest of it, Roadrunner and so on. And he shows how from children's cartoons to adult television series, modern culture saturates us with stories of the forces of good overcoming evil through the application of violence. You know, there's cop shows or Stargate Atlantis or whatever. Actually, Stargate Atlantis Stargate is to me the classic example of what is wrong with military intervention. Wherever those dudes go, they destroy some local society. Okay? And these people on planet X, whatever, will be living quite happily. And okay, it's an oppressive society, but in they go with their do-goodism and they destroy the society. And then they find that some evil, terrible force has been unleashed, which threatens not just that planet, but the entire galaxy, right? And they go, "Oh, that's never happened before. It only happened like 5 episodes ago." It happens. But you get a point. So like popular culture is infused with this idea that the forces of good will overcome evil through the application of violence. And the problem, says Wink, that eventually, I quote him here, "Redemptive violence gives way to violence as an end in itself. It is no longer a religion that uses violence in the pursuit of order and salvation, but one in which violence has become an aphrodisiac, sheer titillation, an addictive high, a substitute for relationships. Violence is no longer the means to a higher good, namely order. Violence becomes the end." And there is actually something to that. Okay? War is habit forming. Okay? So the war in Kosovo, we'll see how this works. So the war in Kosovo led to what commentator David Reed calls a marriage of the human rights left with the new imperialist right. So the human rights left, the sort of Michael Ignatieff of the world, took from Kosovo the lesson that military force could be used as a force for good, to transform the world for the better. As a result, they then became prominent supporters of the invasion of Iraq. So the point here, and you can see this with Ignatieff, is that Iraq is to some degree a product of Kosovo. Okay, the one flowed logically into the other. Okay, and there is a reason why the Ignatieffs of the world supported the invasion of Iraq, which is because they had decided that military intervention was a good thing because they thought it had worked in the past. Okay. And if you look at it that way, Kosovo doesn't seem such a good idea after all. Okay. Even if you think it did some good in and of itself. Now this is in essence a slippery slope argument, okay? But I think it's valid nonetheless. Wink noted that violence is most dangerous when it succeeds. precisely because its very success leads others to imitate it. The only way to avoid sliding down this slippery slope is not to step on it in the first place. So even a successful military intervention is not a good thing, because it will encourage other military interventions. In fact, a successful intervention, according to Wink, is the most dangerous type of intervention. So that is why I said at the start of my talk, we should not intervene in Syria, Iraq, and so on, even if intervening proved to be successful. In fact, a successful intervention could be more damaging in the long term than an unsuccessful one. At least if it's unsuccessful, we might think twice. I thought that about the last Iraq intervention. Not to be true, but one would hope that eventually we'll get the message. Okay? But even if intervention in Iraq and Syria succeeds, it won't be the best use of our resources for all the reasons I previously mentioned about opportunity cost. When the Cold War came to an end, the West had an opportunity to avoid a massive peace dividend, to enjoy a massive peace dividend, to cut our defense expenditure, and to create an international system based on new peaceful principles. But we blew it. Finding ourselves in possession of overwhelming comparative power, and believing that we knew the blueprint for making the world a better place, we wanted to use that power. And we're frustrated to find all sorts of moral and legal principles standing in our way. Instead of stopping to think that maybe those principles were there for a good reason, we chose to start dismantling them to enable us to wage war more easily in the name of human rights, the responsibility to protect, counter-proliferation, counter-terrorism, and the like. To push to lower the barriers standing between us and war through principles such as humanitarian intervention and preventive war has had catastrophic results. These were entirely predictable, but our new humanitarian warriors failed to predict them because they did not consider the nature of what it was they were proposing. In other words, the nature of war, which, as Clausewitz said, is a form of gambling. War is not some precise tool which can be used for easy achievement of an exact political objective. It is an action bedeviled by chance, uncertainty, and chaos. It is by nature unsuited to humanitarian goals. Its costs almost always outweigh its benefits. Its opportunity costs are high. It distorts priorities. It undermines democratic government. It is to be avoided unless truly vital national interests are at stake, which in essence means only when it is a matter of survival. The rules which we create to govern war should reflect this. They should not reflect some ideal of how we would like war to be, or what we think we can achieve by war, or what we hope its outcome will be. The rules of war must reflect the reality of war, a reality which is almost entirely negative. The rules of war, therefore, of military intervention, must therefore serve above all to restrict it to cases of absolute necessity, and not give people leeway to wage it for other reasons. In recent years, people in the West have worked to relax the restrictions against war. In doing so, they have gone in the wrong direction. And at that point, I conclude and happy to take your questions.